Is there a way of making bunting quickly? I don't think there is really, but I have developed my own cheats way of making bunting over the years. So watch on to the end of the video and I'll show you 3 or 4 ways of making bunting. One is the super professional kind of way. I'm going to use my sewing machine. I'm also going to show you how you could make it if you wanted to hand stitch, or if stitching isn't your thing at all, I'm going to share with you a no sew option as well. Hello there, I'm Julie from Julie Davis Flower Workshops and Flower Start, the online flower arranging classes. On this channel you'll find all sorts of videos, mainly flower arranging related, but often with a bit of handicraft thrown in too. This year here in the UK we're celebrating the Queen's Platinum Jubilee, so everything is themed red, white and blue, ready for that special occasion. When I was out with a friend recently, I bought some Union Jack fabric and I thought I would use that as a tablecloth, but when I put it on the table it was just a little bit too much. So then I actually went out to the charity shop and bought myself a square linen double damask tablecloth for £4, which I was rather pleased about. Now the only problem is that the table where we're going to have our tea party celebration is circular. It's a circular table out on my patio. So what I'm planning to do is use a trick my mum used to use, and she always used to put a colourful cloth underneath her white tablecloth to fill in the gaps where you get those spaces where the tablecloth doesn't cover. Now the first thing you probably want to do when you're making your bunting is to decide how long a length of bunting you want to make. Now I wasn't sure how much bunting I wanted to make, so when I went to the haberdashery shop I bought 10 metres of bunting tape. Originally I was going to hang my bunting above the pergola that is above my patio table, but then I saw a photograph on Instagram and that showed bunting draped around the edge of the tablecloth, which I quite like the look of. So I got my daughter to remind me what the calculation was for working out the circumference of the tabletop in order that I could get the right amount of bunting made. And she said it was D times pi, so the diameter of the table times by 3.14. Now the first thing you'll need to do when you're making your bunting is decide what shaped triangle you want to use. Are you going to make quite small bunting, or do you want to make bigger, more imposing pieces? So the bunting I'm using is quite small, or no, it's not tiny, but it's not big, and it's approximately 15 centimetres across on the straight line with a drop down of 15 centimetres. And what I did was to make myself a template out of a sturdy magazine cover, and I've used that to make sure I cut out my even shapes. And what I do is to fold my fabric in half so that each time I cut out a triangle I've got a pair of triangles, and I always use 2 pieces of fabric to make my bunting. You could of course use just 1 piece of fabric, but I find it's not quite substantial enough. It's a little bit lightweight, and of course if for any reason the breeze flips your bunting around, you're going to have the plain side of the fabric showing. So I always make my bunting double-sided. And to make things even easier, I have actually been using my mum's cutter board and her roller blade. You could have just, of course, used your normal fabric cutting scissors. I wouldn't use your kitchen scissors as they're not going to be sharp enough. So I had lots of fun cutting around my triangles, just going backwards and forwards. I think perhaps the blade on my cutter might need replacing, but it was a much faster and more accurate way of cutting. And I didn't cut freehand around my triangles. I had another acrylic measuring ruler that I was able to run up along, and that made things much easier. So in terms of how you're going to put your bunting together, the traditional, the more seamstressy way of making your bunting would be to turn your fabric right side to right side, sew around the 2 diagonal edges, and then turn your bunting the right way around so you can't see where it's been joined. And if you do that, it gives you a really beautiful finish, but it is really time consuming. And what I always find is I need to trim the seam away at the point of the bunting, otherwise you don't get that nice crisp point. And when you come to turn your bunting the right way round, you have to get a knitting needle or a skewer, wooden skewer, just to try and force out that point of the bunting so you get a nice sharp finish. And then what I do was then roll the seams in my hand just to get a flattened edge. And if you were making lots of bunting this way, lots of your flags, you could of course press them with your iron just to get a really smooth finish. Now, because I wanted to make my bunting quite quickly and get a good sheet, this is just something I'm going to use in my own garden. It's not something I'm selling on or making for a friend. I like to top stitch my bunting. So I put the fabric together, wrong sides together, so that the right side of the fabric is showing outwards. And I just do a top stitch, running stitch on my sewing machine, down one diagonal side and up the edge. And I leave the top section open. And you'll find, even though your pattern pieces, your material pieces, were exactly the same shape and size when you came to cut them out, I always find there's a little bit of give and movement when you've used your sewing machine, and those perfectly aligned edges seem to go a little bit skew-if. And you could use them like that and embrace the fact that this is a homemade project. You could even try and purposely fray them so it looks a little bit worn and vintage. But what I like to do is take my pinking shears and give that a zigzag cut to the edges of my bunting pieces, just so they do look properly matched and neat. Now, of course, if you didn't have a sewing machine, what you could do is hand stitch these pieces. So just a nice little running stitch. And that could be something you could do when you were listening to a podcast, favourite music, or your TV show. But it would be quite time consuming to do that. And again, you've got the choice of whether you leave the edges raw or you give them that pinking shear finish. Now, if sewing is absolutely not your thing, you will need to use your glue gun. So I have done a sample with this using my glue gun. In the clip I'm going to show you, you'll see that my hand is shaking a little bit, and I think that was because in hindsight my glue gun hadn't heated up properly and therefore the glue wasn't running quite as smoothly as it should do. So the glue I was using was a hot glue, and it was a general purpose glue, and you can get hot glue that is specially formulated to use with fabric, but I found for this crafting project it seemed to hold together really well. The next thing to think about is when you're putting your bunting together, not only what size you want to use of the little flags, but how close you want to put them together. So you can imagine if you made 10 flags and you butted them up all really close together, you get a length of bunting X length long. But if you made a little bit of gap between each of your triangle pendants, you would make the bunting a little bit longer. So you just need to decide how big a gap you want to leave between each of your flags on your trail of bunting. And the best way to do that is just to eye it up, lay it out in front of you with the bunting tape at the top, and just play around with your flags and see what sort of spacing suits you. So with my bunting, it was 15 centimetres across. I left an approximate 5 centimetre gap between each pieces of the bunting, each of the flags. And again, if you were a neat worker, you would probably measure this out and pin it out, but really I was just eyeing it up when I was running the bunting through my sewing machine. Now again, if you don't have a sewing machine, you can hot glue your bunting in place. So what I would do is, once you get your bunting tape in front of you, you're going to have to fold it in half. It'll have to be folded in half when you've finished making your bunting. And if you were using your hot glue, I would put a trail of glue halfway up the piece of bunting and put your little bunting flag on it, and then put a trail of glue on the top face of your flag, and then fold the bunting tape on top of it and pinch to close it. What I then do is I then glue along the gap between the pieces of bunting, so you've got a consistent length of your tape all the way across. Now my tape was probably a little bit over 1 centimetre wide. It was probably 1.2 millimetres wide, 1.2 centimetres wide. So when I folded it, it was about 6 millimetres deep, and that is what my bunting tape looks like all the way across my flags. And the only downside with gluing that way is it did make my bunting look a little bit stiff, but that could have been because I wasn't using the fabric glue, and also my hot glue wasn't quite as hot as it should have been. The other option is to hand sew your little flags in place, and that's just a matter of pinning your bunting onto your bunting tape, folding it over, and then just doing a simple running stitch throughout. Now, one thing to look out for is that the reason I clipped the edges of my bunting flags with the pinking shears is because the flags moved around a little bit when I was sewing them. And you may find that when you come to work with your own little flags, that when you look at the top edge, it isn't precisely matched. So what you might want to do is just trim them with a straight pair of scissors across the top to even up a little bit. And the reason I say that is because when you're working with your bunting, you'll be working on the top edge of it, and it may well look fine and beautiful to you. And then when you flap your bunting over, you discover that you haven't quite caught that back piece of fabric in place underneath your bunting tape. Now, the easiest way for me to make my bunting, the fastest way, was to use my sewing machine. And what I start off by doing is folding my bunting tape in half and using a straight stitch on my sewing machine, sliding in my flag and pinning it in place, sandwiching over the top bit of tape, and then pinning or holding that in place. I then convert to quite a wide zigzag, and the reason I do that is just to catch any of those loose edges. But as I went through making the bunting, every so often I would just turn my flags over just to make sure I had properly caught the fabric securely underneath the bunting tape. And then you're on a little bit of a production line, and you just need to keep going. So for this project, I bought myself 2 meters of fabric. I've got plenty of fabric left. I've probably got at least 1 meter, 1 meter 20 of fabric left. And what I've done with my bunting is I didn't cut off the tape right at the end, and I was really pleased about that. Because I want my bunting to go around my table, I'm going to need to sort of work out the drapage on it. And as it happens, I've done a bit of a mock-up and discovered that I'm about another metre short, which means I'll need to make another 6 or so of these little bunting flags. So the job is never quite finished until it's absolutely finished. But that's because I'm wanting to make my bunting to hang in a really specific location. So I could just have gone straight ahead and made 10 metres of bunting. But I was thinking, why make 10 metres if I could make it a little bit shorter? But that turned round and bit me on the bottom, really. Now you'll see that I said that I had bought some Union Jack flags to make my bunting with, and what I've ended up doing is having my flag, none of them are discernibly Union Jacks, but they are red, white and blue. And the reason I didn't mind cutting down my big flags was I didn't want it to look like these were just bunting I was making for the Jubilee celebrations. I want this bunting to be usable in the future, so it's got that nod to the red, white and blue of the occasion, but it doesn't look out of place. So if I put these up for a family party or something else I'm doing later in the summer or next year, it's still going to look like lovely bunting without looking specifically royal or specifically for the Jubilee occasion. And that's what I always like to do, make sure whatever you make for your parties and family gatherings is usable for other occasions. So the last time I made bunting whole scale was in 2012, which was the previous Jubilee. I think it must have been the Diamond Jubilee then. It was the year of the London Olympics and also the year that Kate and William got married. And the bunting I'm going to string up above my patio table in the pergola we've got there is also red, white and blue, but actually it's made up of 3 different fabrics. I've got a solid blue fabric, a large blue gingham, and from memory I think it's a red with a white flower print on it, and that comes out year after year when we have family celebrations in our garden. Having made my bunting, I'm just going to mock up how it's going to look outside. Over the course of the next few weeks, I'll be planning my table settings with my blue and red transferware. I've also been thrifting various items from soft cushions, and I've also thrifted a Union Jack teapot for £3. But before we get bang into that festive and celebratory period, I'm just going to refresh some of the flowers I've got on my patio table. I'm going to whip off my tablecloth once I have satisfied myself I'm happy with my drapage and the length of my bunting. And the pots, the crockery pots that I had my spring flowering bulbs in, I'm going to replant and put some white flowers in there, and I could use those as a table centrepiece when we do have our tea party. If you've got any great tips for bunting, do share them with me in the comments below. And that's all from me for now, and I'll see you next time.